Matthews, you believe in a robust free will, so-called libertarian free will, right?
Yes, yes.
You also have a rather strong sense of God's involvement in the world, such that God is involved in acts, all sorts of things. Now that, on the surface, seems to be contradictory. So help me to understand what you mean by God acting in our lives, and how that is not an inhibition of free will.
Yeah, so I think I want to hold a traditional view of God's involvement in the world, where God is the creator, the cause, the source of everything that exists apart from himself. So any entity other than God, God would be the cause of. So what does that mean for creaturely actions? Well, it would mean that whatever those actions consist in, they're distinct from God, so God must be the cause of those actions. And this is where the problem that you suggest arises. It looks like our very actions would have to be caused by God, which creates a kind of tension with the robust freedom that you were mentioning.
Let's just understand the process by which God does that, because many people believe, many religious people, that God created the universe, set the laws of physics, nature, and motion, and they sort of went by themselves, although some people think God intervenes every once in a while, some people think that God does not, but the laws run by themselves. Your sense is a stronger sense of God's involvement on a sustaining basis?
Yes, it's a much stronger sense than just God creating the laws in the beginning and things in the beginning, and then it just sort of unwinds from there. Rather, and I think this is really the traditional theistic view, God is the source of all that exists as it's doing what it does throughout the entire duration that anything exists apart from God. The laws of nature, I mean, that's people have different interpretations of what they are. It seems to me that what laws are is statements of regularities in the behavior of things. And so the laws don't come before the things in their behavior. The things in their behavior become before the laws. So the way in which God is responsible for the laws of nature really, I think, is by being responsible for the things and their behavior acting in the regular ways that they do.
Okay, now if that were true, I'm not saying I believe it, but I'm saying if that were true, that would give God a very strong sense of being the creator, but it would now put substantial pressure on your hope that our free will is really free in a libertarian sense. So now you have a paradox that you have to try to resolve.
Yeah, it would put pressure. I think a lot of people think if you hold that strong conception where our very actions are caused by God, then you get a kind of theological determinism, which would be incompatible with libertarian freedom.
And theological determinism means that not just that God knows what you're going to do, but God is literally causing what you're going to do in order to fulfill his plan or whatever.
Yeah, and I want to hold that God is causing our action, but not determining it. And so maybe it's helpful to, what do I mean by determinism there? Determinism, I take it, one event, one condition determines another if it is both prior to the other and it's logically sufficient for the other, or it necessitates the other. What I mean by that is that it's not possible for the one event or the one condition to hold and the other not to hold. So if you have a case where you have one thing, one event, that is prior to another event, and it's such that it's not possible for the one event to hold and not the other, then that other event is determined, right? And so what it looks like is if you've got God, or many people think if you have God causing our action, you have the introduction of some sort of event, God's causing, God's decree, God's volition, that is prior to my action and logically sufficient for my action, determining my action, and then it's not free in that robust libertarian sense.
Sure. Okay. So that's the problem.
So that's the problem. So how do you solve it? Well, I think the key is having the right account of divine agency. The sort of account of agency that creates the problem is one where you think of God's causing my act, let's say, or any other creature, is involving some sort of divine decree or the choice or volition that is prior to my action, and which is that in virtue of which God brings about my act. That prior volition or decree, then, it would be prior, but it also seems like it'd be logically sufficient for. If God decrees that I act such and such a way, it's not possible that I not act in such and such a way. Well, if that's your conception, then God's causing my act would determine it.
Right.
What I want to hold is that there's no such prior decree on God's part by virtue of which God brings about my act. Rather, what it is for God to cause my act or to cause any other creature is simply for my act to be causally dependent directly, immediately on God.
Are you saying that there is a difference or not a difference between God's involvement in volitionary acts of sentient creatures and non-sentient physical actions that go on in the world all the time?
I think there's no difference there. God is the cause of all of it. Okay, but you know, the question that interests me here primarily is how could God be the cause of our free acts and yet those acts not be determined? And I think the short answer is that in order for God's causing our acts to determine them, God's causing our acts would have to introduce some condition that is both prior to our acts and logically sufficient for them. And God doesn't introduce such a condition. Why? Well, God is certainly prior to our acts as the cause of our acts, but God's not logically sufficient for our acts. Why? Well, to say that God is logically sufficient would mean that the mere existence of God entails or necessitates my action. Okay? It would mean that God isn't free to act otherwise than he does. It would mean that if my action is contingent, then God would end up being contingent, right? Or if God's necessary, my act would be necessary, right? And neither one of those is the case. So God isn't, though he's prior, he's not logically sufficient. And so he doesn't count as a logically sufficient and prior condition. And neither does God's causing my act count as prior and logically sufficient, because God's causing my act is not prior to my act. Rather, God's causing my act has my act as a constituent, if you will. God's causing my act just is my act qua dependent on God. And so as something that has my act as a constituent, God's causing my act isn't prior to my act, right? So neither God nor God's causing my act, on my view, is both prior to and logically sufficient for my act, and so it doesn't determine my act.
Can I ask this question? What do you need in addition to God to make it logically sufficient?
You would need something such that that thing's existence entailed or necessitated my act. So God's causing my act, God's act, if you will, of causing my act, that is logically sufficient for my act. That is, there's no possible world in which God causes my act and my act doesn't exist. So God's causing my act is logically sufficient for my act. The thing is, it's not prior to my act. Why is it not prior? Because on my view, God's causing my act just is my act with the relation of dependence on God. God's causing my act, therefore, has my act as a constituent. If it has my act as a constituent, it's not prior to my act.